I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Isaac Sasson, Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Tel Aviv University. I'll be moderating this panel on demography and also participate in the latter part. This session is part of the IIASA Israel Symposium held here at Tel Aviv University. I welcome you all to the demography panel, which is a key part of the IIASA focus on systems analysis. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers divided into two sessions. The first one will deal with current research in demography and frontiers in demographic research. And the second, then we'll break for coffee, and the second session will focus on demographic research in Israel, specifically challenges and opportunities. And as I said, we'll have a coffee break in the middle, and hopefully we can be on time and finish at 12:30. In the interest of time, I will not have a lengthy introduction. I'll just introduce the speakers for the first panel. We'll have Juho Härkönen from the European University Institute in Florence, who will be joining us via Zoom. And myself, I will also speak on this first panel. In the second session, we'll have Dr. Analia Schlosser, Senior Lecturer of Economics at Tel Aviv University, Professor Alex Weinreb, Research Director at the Taub Center and former Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, and Professor Daniel Gotlieb, former Chief Scientist at the Israel Social Security Administration, Bituach Leumi, and Professor at the former Professor of Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I think we can start by turning over to Professor Lutz, and the floor is yours.
I am now currently serving as Deputy Director General for Science, but for 25 years I've been leading the World Population Program at IIASA. And since IIASA was established exactly 50 years ago in 72, for 10 years, Andre Rogers was the head of the population group. He's back in Boulder, Colorado, and he really initiated some of this, what is also called as multi-state demographies. And then for 10 years, Nathan Kifitz was the leader of the World Population Program. You know him as, may know him as the author of most of the textbooks in mathematical demography that we are still using today. After retiring from Harvard, he was at IIASA until '84, when I had come back from the University of Pennsylvania and then followed him. And so we took this multi-dimensional concept in a way to more applications, now doing population projection for all countries in the world and reconstructions, as you will see, not only by the conventional age and sex structure, but also by level of educational attainment and, where possible, by labor force participation and other dimensions. So it's worth stepping back and asking, what is demography? So the classic definition of the discipline of demography, as you will find it in most textbooks, and also the IIASA, the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, had it for many years on its website. It is the scientific study of changing population size and structures. Important to notice that it's in the plural. It's not just the age structure. For many people, age structure is synonymous with demographic change, but it's multiple structures. So that is where multi-dimensional demography focuses directly on. We look, of course, age and sex, and that is the key demographic methodology. And place of residence is, of course, very important. As education has said, labor force participation, ethnicity, in the US they call it race. So which are the demographic dimensions? Well, Schreig and Siegel, in their big textbook in demography, they say those that are traditionally collected in census. That all you have it in the demographic section of the survey. These are demographic. And then it's important to note also much of the research these days is going on at the micro level, life cycle analysis and so on. But by its origin, demos, the Greek word, is the population. It's the aggregate. So we are primarily looking in demography at changes at the macro level. But here you see this famous Coleman ship that sort of shows how there is a constant interaction. We can only understand the changes at the macro level outcomes in terms of the age structure of the population and the size. If we go into sort of the micro foundations that are the micro level conditions, the micro outcomes, so the decisions to have a birth or have a child or move from one place to the other. So, and of course, there's this constant back and forth between micro and macro. So much of what I'm telling you now has been recently summarized last year. This advanced introduction to demography has come out. So if you want to have more definitions and more content, I encourage you. It's a pretty cheap paperback book. So I only brought 2 copies with me, but it can thank you more. What is sort of new in this book, and I'm talking about 3 major demographic theories. Theories, I mean, that have predictive power at the level of aggregate population. So we're not talking about a fertility theory that is only partially demographic, but how populations change, as the definition says, in its size and structures in plural. And actually this idea of demographic metabolism has been coined by Norman Ryder, a very famous demographer. He, in 1965, published this important paper on the cohort as an approach to analysis, which is widely used in sociology as well. And he said that actually the main force that drives social change is the replacement of generations. So it's one cohort replacing the others as they move up the age pyramid, and then the old ones die. And this is the main mechanisms how societies change. And you can, like here, illustrate it just very nicely with the age pyramid. So as you see, we added some color as a third dimension. So the color gives you the educational attainment. So red means never been to school, yellow means primary, light blue secondary, and dark blue tertiary. And here you see the Republic of Korea that has gone through one of the most rapid education expansion probably in human history. You saw there in 1970, yes, the young have started to get education, but you see almost everybody above the age of 45 or so is still in dark red, particularly the women more than the men. Because when these cohorts were at a young age, school age, they didn't have the opportunity to get any education in the 40s or 30s in Korea. But now you see this cohort of already rather well-educated sort of 20-year-old, 20 to 25-year-olds, 20 years later, moving up 20 years by 1990, and then by 2010 is yet another 20 years older, and then we can continue this into the future. This is really the main strength of demography, that because the life is relatively long these days, 70, 80 or more years, and if some characteristics are established at young age, like educational attainment, or particularly having at least secondary education is usually finished at the age of 25, but what you've learned, all these benefits of the human capital, so to say, you carry on throughout the rest of your life. And that we can predict fairly well into the future. We only have to adjust for differential mortality and differential migration. But these are so only changes at the margin. If you know the cohort size, you have a good analytical handle. And this essentially is sort of the model of the multidimensional cohort component projection. So it's very similar to the usual model of population projection by age and sex. You just have subpopulations, so you have the women with different education groups have different patterns of age-specific fertility for each education group. The same is true for mortality and migration. So you just shift the pyramid, the whole structure, up 5 years in a 5-year step, and then add sort of the birth born by, implied by the differential fertility rate to the youngest age group. Now we have done these reconstructions to 1950 and projections by different scenarios until the end of this century for all countries in the world in the context of these shared socioeconomic pathways. This is the scenario framework that is used in the climate change research community now all over the world. Like if you look at the most recent IPCC report, it's full of references to these SSPs, these shared socioeconomic pathways. And these multidimensional population projections by age, sex, and education, we call sort of the human core of the SSP. They describe both the capacity of societies to mitigate, so to reduce their CO2 emissions, and in particular the capacity to adapt to already unavoidable climate change, and we'll talk more about this later. We put this out last night for Israel, we have for every country. It's the UN data for the age structure, but we then filled it with color. We added the color through the reconstruction. So you see in 1960, Israel was a very young population. You see in gray there below 15-year-olds, but you also had a sizable, completely uneducated in dark red, and low educated with only primary education. 1990, already the population doubled, as you see from the size, to about 4.5 million. It's still a very young population, and you see this younger, the bigger cohorts now, so there really is a break around age 45, and you see the younger ones increasingly getting better educated as well. Now this is 2020 then, it's still looking like a pyramid. Also you have now very high education, not quite as high as in Korea for the youngest cohorts, but and you still have some low educated population segments there in the middle. But still, this is sort of unique. If I've seen so many such pyramids, and typically you have the very young age pyramids in developing countries where you have very low levels of education. Here you have a young pyramid combined with high levels of education. And this is truly a unique feature of the Israeli population. And these are some of the different scenarios. This is the medium scenario, the SSP2 to 2050. It depends on the migration pattern closely, and we also did zero migration and double migration scenarios. We played with different fertility rates, with different rates of education. But this gives a very positive picture of the development of human capital in Israel. And here you see we also can plot this trend from the 1950 to, here in this case, 2060, and you see this massive increase in the Israeli population. Of course, immigration played a major role, and of course many of these immigrants came with relatively high formal education, and you see that much of this increase is really adding the light blue and the dark blue, which is secondary and post-secondary education. Another topic that we cannot discuss today is the quality of education, but we also increasingly went into indicators of quality of education and not just formal education. Just to show you that not for all countries it's going to be such a smooth ride. This is Nigeria. Nigeria, if they have this very optimistic scenario that, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals would imply that the education would spread similar to Korea, then indeed in about 30, 40 years, Nigeria could also look more like a developed country, like a European country. But if there's stalled development, which you see the SSP3 on the right-hand side, schooling essentially, the expansion of schooling stops. And then because they still have so many women with very low education, particularly in the north of Nigeria, with very high fertility, so actually the illiterate population, the completely uneducated population would also increase. And the population size overall would be almost 1 billion. So you have these very contrasting future possibilities for countries that are still in the middle of demographic transition. Where you all know the pattern, this is just DHS data for 58 countries, sorted by the level of education. So every country is located at its average education, and then the color, average fertility, and then the color gives you, maybe I should get closer to the microphone that the people online could hear it better. So the color gives you the level of education. So you see in every country, the red, the uneducated women have much higher fertility than the blue ones, which is really from 7 for the uneducated in some African countries to below 2 for the most highly educated. You have this very strong educational gradient. We recently tried to translate this also. What would it bring? Like the Sustainable Development Goals have often been criticized of not explicitly addressing demography and population. Population as such is not mentioned there. So many people think that's the elephant in the room. That is the real big problem for humanity. And in this paper, we translated the education goals and the health goals into alternative future fertility and mortality trajectories. And you see here, like the green area is the UN population projection. The green line then is sort of our SSP2, the medium variant, where we are already lower, somewhat lower than the UN. And if we still then implement the Sustainable Development Goals, we are still lower. So in other words, meeting the education goals, universal primary and secondary education of girls and boys, as well as the reproductive health goals that are in the SDGs, then the world population trajectory will be much lower. So indirectly, of course, the SDGs affect population growth. Now, with respect to mortality, I've been doing some work recently on what is called the Preston curve in 1975. Sam Preston published this influential paper of plotting on what you see on the right-hand side, GDP per capita against life expectancy. He did it for the 1930s and 60s, and we in a recent paper in PDR revisit this for 1970s, 90s, and 2010. And you see essentially the same pattern that yes, the life expectancy is leveling off with higher income, but if you focus on the education, it's a much more clear linear relationship, and there's less of an unexplained shift. So time is running, and I'm jumping to the last point, which is now four-dimensional population projections in the context of population aging. So here we see for European countries, the population broken down by age, sex, level of education, and labor force participation ratio. So the red is not in the labor force, the green is in the labor force, and the shading gives you the difference, the education differences. And you see, for instance, Italian women are working to a much lesser degree than Swedish women on the right-hand side. And now, just the final thing, we've done this now, forecasts and with different dependency ratios that really follow from our multidimensional definition. So the green is the conventional old age dependency ratio, where I simply take the population only classified by age, those above 65 and below 20 related to those 20 to 64. There is a high increase. There's a 60% increase for the European Union, and that's what scares everybody. That's why aging is considered a problem. But then if you already consider the labor force dependency ratio, that is the red line. This is simply taking people who are not working to people who are in the labor force. And because so many people below age 65 are not in the labor force today, the increase is much weaker. You see only a 20%. And then the third one is what we call the productivity-weighted labor force dependency ratio. And that's where you also factor in that the young cohorts are better educated, and an educated worker earns a higher salary, is more productive than a less educated. So if you combine labor force participation and education, you really see a much lower increase in the dependency ratio here. And then once you combine this with different migration patterns, like at the bottom you see Canadian-style migration, where you have lots of migrants, but selectively highly educated migrants that quickly integrate. Under such a pattern, even despite of the rapid aging of the baby boom generation, European dependency would actually decline rather than increase. So in other words, if a multidimensional view of the population gives you a very different, and in most cases, a more positive outlook for the future than simply looking one-dimensionally at the age structure. Well, we don't have really time now to go to the... yesterday I talked extensively in my keynote about the importance of these education projections for ability to cope with climate change, where in this science article, the subtitle was "Fund More Educators" rather than just engineers, because education really empowers people to more actively adapt to unavoidable climate change. But time is running, and I want to close with saying a few words about the Vienna area. So IIASA has this long-standing population program. Then the Academy of Sciences has since also 20 years an internationalized Vienna Institute of Demography. And now 3 years ago, the University of Vienna opened a new department of demography, where we actually have a doctoral program and a master's program in global demography. And these three pillars, as we call it, IIASA, Academy of Sciences, and University of Vienna, form together what we call the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. I'm sure there are many questions, but my time is over, and I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can take a couple of questions right now from the audience, if there are any, before we move on to the next talk. I already asked my question yesterday.
Is there going to be a discussion at the end?
Hopefully, yeah, we are going to have time for discussion at the end, so you can save your questions. The next talk is by Dr. Eliahu Ben-Moshe.
Okay. Michael? This is the microphone.
Good morning to everyone. It looks like a continuation of Prof's presentation. I'm going to talk about the interaction between demography and economy, and about the special case of Israel that was already mentioned by Professor Schultz. This paper has been prepared in collaboration with Professor Barbara Otten, also from the University of Jerusalem. One. Great. As we all students of demography know, we have three variables that have been originally mentioned as affecting per capita income, as we called 1958, population size, population growth rate. We are going to concentrate on population age structure today, and we are going to talk about the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend logic goes in this way. We have three multiplying terms. Income per capita, the total income, GDP per capita, can be expressed as the product of the proportion at working ages. This is the main variable that we are going to talk about today. The labor force participation rate, how many of those in working ages are participating actually in the labor force, and the productivity of each worker, how much is he producing, what are the productivity rates of these workers. If we have two populations, one population A with a proportion of working ages of just 50% and some participation rate and some productivity levels, we can compare it with the population B, then we have the same productivity and participation rates, but we increase the 50% by just 1%. That means that we have a change to 51% or a difference of 1%, and we can see that these two equations are differentiated by a factor of 1.02, meaning that the income per capita should increase for each 1% addition to the proportion at working ages by 2%. Of course, it depends on the level of the participation rates. If the participation rates are much lower, an increase of 1% would produce an increase in income per capita of 2.5%. If it's much higher, like 60 and increasing to 61, the increase will be only 1.7% increase, indeed around 2% per each percentage point increase in the proportion of population at working ages. A few main characteristics, demographic characteristics. Israel has been experiencing very high growth rates, as it was mentioned before. This is coming from two reasons: large waves of immigration. I would mention two, the more important ones: the mass migration in the 50s that duplicated the population in less than 5 years, and the 1 million immigration from former Soviet Union relatively lately, during the 90s, but also because very high natural increase. In practice, 2/3 of the population growth of Israel is explained by natural increase and not by migration, and this is because very high fertility levels, also in the past, but still in the present, from over 4 in the 50s to still 3 births per woman today. Let's see what this produced in terms of the peculiar age structure dynamics of 2020. We saw this pyramid before. If we look at the pyramid, we can look at pyramids demographers historically. Some additional information we learned about the demographic history. And we see this classical triangle that we expected in the population 65 and over. And we see that there is a difference because there is these two protuberances in this triangle, that this is a kind of baby boom that we got. We can look at the pyramid in 1955, we see those born immediately after the Second War, born in 45, 54, were very large cohorts. It's tempting to assume that it was a baby boom. In practice, was the combined effect of immigration and very high fertility of the new immigrants. But this creates some kind of structure that you can see here. If you look at this five-year cohorts, that we see that the baby boomers are at the top of this structure, and this structure was created because immediately after immigration, fertility rates begin to decline. They decline at the beginning slowly, but continuously, and that's the reason that we got this formation here in the pyramid. That means that the large cohorts begin to grow much more modestly later. But we can see that in the pyramid of 1980, where all these five-year cohorts are included in the pyramid, and we see that at this time, these 5 cohorts are the same, are entering the main childbearing ages. That means that there are many women, many population moment, it was called, I think it was 1950, that is the term. Friedlander in the paper of 75 called that the echo effect, and we see these protuberances again here in the next structure, and you will see it here. We see that we have like a replica of the first structure, but broader. That is the echo effect, the population moment effect, familiar to all demographers, and we see it for the third time again. These are the grandchildren of the first structure, but there is a twist here, and the twist is that we do not get the reduction in the growth of the new cohort, but we get an increase, and this is because it's incredible to believe, but the high fertility of Israel in the last 15 years has been increasing, and we are today with a higher fertility rates than we were 15 years ago. So, but we are going to concentrate, as I said, in the percentage at working ages, because this is the main issue in the demographic dividend mechanism. We see that the percentage at working ages, 20 to 64 here, declined, stagnated, increased, and declined. Let's add to it the children and the elders to this graph, and we will see how and why the decline happened. If we look at the children, we see that the increase of that we saw it as the cohorts of the baby boomers produced a huge decline in the proportion at working ages. That was also a small increase in the proportion of the elders, of those 65 and over. Then we have a long period of stagnation, very, very peculiar, because fertility continued to decrease. If you remember, we saw fertility was decreasing all the time, but we got a decrease in fertility counter-rested by an increase in the proportion of the old population, and that created a stagnation period in which the proportion of the working age didn't change almost. And then we have the last period, the prosperity period, if you want to call it, where we in Israel we got the demographic dividend for the first and last time until the moment. And it was created because both the decline in the proportion of children, that was because of this decline in general fertility rates, that was not this time counter-rested as it was in the past by an increase in the proportion of old persons, and we got this demographic dividend. It was an increase of almost 5%, that means almost 10% potential increase in the GDP per capita. And since 2009, we have a decline in the proportion at working ages, and this is bad news. And this is both because, again, because of the baby boomers. This time the baby boomers arrived to retirement age, and then they reduced the proportion at working. So we are going to look at the future of Israel based on the population projections prepared by the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics for the period 2015-65. There are small differences in the three scenarios in mortality, but they are not important. The important thing is that in the first, the high scenario, TFR, is increasing from 3.3 to 4.5. In the low, decreasing from 3 to 2. Remember that this increase and decreases are very, very slow. We are talking about the period of about 50 years, a lot of time. And we have the medium scenario where TFR remains stable around 3.2. The assumptions of migration are the same in the three scenarios. We should mention that this have been prepared based on three different subpopulations, but we are looking at the whole at the population. And what happened, or what should happen to the population in the future in terms of the proportion at working ages and the possibility to get a new demographic dividend. We can see that only under the low scenario, that means huge, rapid, relatively rapid decrease over 50 years of the fertility from 3 to 2, we are not going to keep the same levels of the proportion population at working ages. The difference between the low scenario and the high scenario, where we continue the same trends in fertility we are experiencing in the last 15 years, is huge. It's over 10%, the difference of about 20% in GDP per capita. It's a huge difference. It's something more interesting also is that the stagnation in fertility, the medium scenario, no change in fertility, also leads to a very, very sharp decrease in the proportion of working ages, of course, less than the high. So we should conclude the proportion of working age. There are large differences between the scenarios. That means that fertility was responsible for most of the changes we saw in the past. It's going to be responsible for Israeli future economically and demographically. The difference between the low and high is of 5% already in 2032. So its fertility remains at the current level, continues to increase. We will get already in 32 5% less GDP per income per capita. And if we wait until 2065, the income per capita may be reduced by 22% unless fertility is reduced. And only the low scenario of the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics is keeping the proportion of working age at current levels. So, fertility decline, as we saw, played a critical role in increasing the proportion of working ages. This increase undoubtedly contributed to the transformation of Israel from a third world country where we got glass of milk from UNICEF for our children in the 50s to become a member of the OECD and a recognized developed country. Without fertility decline, the proportion at working ages is expected to decline sharply. Keeping the level of fertility will not be enough. We have to do much better than that if we want to increase our welfare. The opportunity is in the actual high fertility. The high fertility gives this demographic dividend. It's the dividend that we get when we have high fertility, to reduce it sharply and to catch this demographic dividend. This is a necessity in Israel. Fertility decline is extremely needed to face future challenges. Israel has to challenge, of course, the population aging, as any other developed country, and needs to challenge another demographic challenge, and it's that in the next decades we are going to experience a change in the composition of the population of Israel when part of the population that has very low participation rates and very low productivity, it's going to enter the labor force when we must to invest to make them increase participation, to increase their productivity, and this will require a lot of resources, and there are non-demographic, non-exactly demographic challenges. It's the climate crisis. We are a country between the Mediterranean Sea and between the desert, in a region that is warming much faster than the rest of the world, that we should expect we will need a lot of resources to deal with the mitigation and in particular the adaptation to the changes in the climate. So fertility seems to be an issue, an important issue, and what will happen in the future we will talk about 20 or 30 years from now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eliahu. I already have many questions, but I'll save them to the end, to the discussion. We'll move on to the next speaker, who will join us via Zoom. Juho, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. So, thanks a lot for having me and asking me to present in this conference. It would have been, of course, very nice to be there in Tel Aviv. But it's good that I can do it over Zoom as well. So this presentation is a bit different from the previous two ones in the sense that here I look at education as the outcome, so as the output, and what this paper that I'm presenting looks at is to look at like very early experiences, so perinatal health, so the health that a fetus experiences in the womb, but how that has an effect, or has it an effect on educational attainment levels. And what we look at here is this question both from an individual point of view, so that what are the estimated effects of having various perinatal health adversities on educational levels at the individual level, but also we look at that, do these actually have any importance at the population level? And I mean, many of you of course know about a lot of work in the social gradients of mortality and health, where it's often the starting point is that the social conditions determine health and later mortality. So here it kind of flips the other way around. So we look at the effects of health on attaining education. And this is joint work with Marco Cozzano, Nico Härkönen, and Matti Lindenberg. So as an introduction, now we are not the first ones, of course, to ask this question, and I believe that many of you in the audience are aware of this, familiar with this literature already, but this is still a relatively new literature. Just 20 years ago, that this was all new and exciting, and in this overview paper by James Smith wrote that there were new theories that even look at even intrauterine factors for predicting socioeconomic outcomes. And this focus on kind of very early experiences really caught up in social scientists and economists' imagination, especially following Jim Heckman's emphasis on how especially the first 3 years and the conditions during the first 3 years matter a lot for socioeconomic outcomes. Now, there's a growing industry almost of research into this, and it typically finds that prenatal health do have problems, do have persistent influences. So that being yes, where was I? Okay, so a lot of these studies have shown that those who are exposed to adverse prenatal health conditions, that has long-term influence in terms of education, in terms of labor force participation, incomes, you name it. And by extension, that is implied that these are important factors affecting socioeconomic attainment at the population level. And it's also implied that because we know that prenatal health is socially stratified, that these can be one of the pathways and mechanisms through which social advantage and disadvantage are transmitted from one generation to the next. Now, what we that this is kind of that there's a lot of intuitive appeal into this argument that there's population level relevance, there's relevance of social mobility, and so forth. But actually, we know very little about this in practice. That how much of this is actually true or not. So, what we focus on in this paper is that we kind of identify two limitations that we find in the previous literature, but both are from this idea of what is the population level relevance. But the first one is that there's been a focus on a limited indicators of perinatal health. So birth weight is the most common exposure that has been looked at. And if you ask pediatricians and so forth, that they would say, well, birth weight is an indicator of something else typically, and then there's a whole range of other conditions that might be important that they also monitor regularly at health checkups. And the other types of studies have looked at rare natural or man-made disasters as exposure. And the second limitation we find is this lack of explicit assessment of how much socioeconomic outcomes is actually affected at the population level by prenatal health conditions. So what we do then is that our contribution is to estimate effects of some common perinatal health indicators, but we use sibling fixed effects and we use Finnish population registers to do this. And then we also estimate the population relevance of these effects on educational data. So that here come the two contributions from population relevance. We look at the range of common perinatal health indicators, and then we estimate these population attributable fractions that are familiar to those who are epidemiologists on that how much this matters of the population. And what we find is that perinatal health has limited population level relevance on educational data. Just very briefly about previous studies. But I mentioned already that many previous studies have used birth weight as an indicator of perinatal health, that those which look at kind of commonly measured outcomes that have used birth weight almost not exclusively, but almost exclusively. And even if birth weight is seen as a global measure, it doesn't capture everything. There's first of all, birth weight is composed of two. Is a function of gestational length and gestational growth rate, and often these haven't been differentiated, even though that they partly have different etiologies, but also that then there's other prenatal conditions that might have influences outside, independently of birth weight, and in this respect, prenatal smoking, for example, is mentioned as one example. And now the other group of previous studies have looked at disasters such as earthquakes, pandemics, Chernobyl, terrorism, and so forth as natural experiments, and looked at how children exposed to these disasters, that what their outcomes are, either in the short term, in terms of birth weight, or then in the longer term in terms of educational outcomes. Now, these natural experiments, of course, have very high internal validity. That if you're able to really properly estimate who was exposed, who was not exposed, then it gets high internal validity. Now, then the external validity is unclear, but luckily Chernobyl doesn't happen very often, so that we don't know that what we can say about, for example, exposure to radioactivity during pregnancy, but about its effects, that how can we say something about prenatal health in general, that the external validity for this reason remains unclear. So what we look at a set of common perinatal health indicators we have next to birth weight and the two components, intrauterine growth and prematurity or gestational age. We look at smoking in pregnancy, we look at anemia, and we look at gestational hypertension and preeclampsia. And all these are found in the birth registers, which also implies that these are conditions and indicators that are monitored, routinely monitored, and therefore have clinical relevance. That they are seen as potential problems during the pregnancy, and that's why they are monitored as well. Now, the data we use come from Finnish medical birth registers, which is combined with other population registers, such as on the education, and then also on the parents features. But we look at specifically at birth cohorts born, 3 birth cohorts born in the late 80s, who then were around 30 years old at the last measurement when we measure their educational outcomes. We have roughly 180,000 individuals in our data, and then when we narrow it down to the sibling sample, that we get 34,000 siblings roughly in 17,000 families, and we exclude twins. Now, the variables we look at educational attainment as an outcome. We break it down to 2 binary outcomes, that whether you complete a secondary degree and a tertiary degree. The birth outcome measures I mentioned here are the operationalizations of those. I'm not going to dive into more detail, but then next to those we also have a range of controls, especially for the sibling methods that we look at, have controls that differ between the siblings. We have birth month, birth order, month's age, where they live, the parental education, which applies in the between regressions, and mother's relationship status. We, as methods, our main method for analyzing these effects is sibling fixed effects. It's not perfect in terms of causal inference, but in any case, for these kinds of questions that where we look at, where we don't have natural experiments on these, and we look at like actually occurring common prenatal health indicators, that it's probably the best model, especially that it can at least control for variables that are shared by the siblings. Now, to compare these sibling fixed effects, we also estimate random effects models, so multi-level models, that also have information about the variation between the families, and linear probability models in both cases. And we compare a few models with and without adjustments. So this is briefly our control strategy, but this is kind of a gag that we think about that when we select the controls for the different variables. That, for example, when we look at birth weight, that we control for all of these prenatal, the other health factors. But if we look at the effects of maternal smoking, we don't. Now, finally, on methods that we also calculate to assess this population level relevance, we calculate population attributable fractions. That briefly these tell us that what share of the outcomes can be attributable to the exposure and at the population level. So that we basically divide the estimated effect that we get by the probability of the outcome among the exposed, and then multiply it by the probability of those exposed. So that gives us an indication of how much more education should we see if an exposure had, but if there was no exposure to, for example, prenatal smoking. But if all smoking mothers stop smoking, how much more education at the population level we might be seeing. Now, some key descriptives. The main ones I would say are that roughly 40% have a tertiary degree by the age of 30. 90% have at least a secondary degree. That low birth weight is relatively rare in Finland, whereas maternal smoking during pregnancy is relatively common, and it's actually still interestingly enough about that 15% that it was in this late 80s cohort. Then going to our results, So the black lines are the estimates from sibling fixed effects models, and the gray ones are from the random effects models. So what we can basically see is that we have in most cases the confidence intervals overlap with 0 in the fixed effects models, which are preferred ones, suggesting that in most cases these prenatal health conditions don't matter for educational attainment. In some cases, for example, if we look at smoking and the completion of a secondary degree, that should be secondary and not compulsory in the graph, that we can see that there's a negative effect, that even though the confidence intervals just overlap with 0, that the overlap is pretty small. So we want to discuss that should we conclude that there's an effect or not. But in most other cases, that there's a kind of a clear overlap. So we conclude that most of these exposures or these health conditions don't matter for educational outcomes. The clear examples are low birth weight and the component of low birth weight small for gestational age. So a child who was born 2 standard deviations below the weight for the gestational age from the growth curve, that they tend to have roughly 7% lower probability of a percentage point for probability of attaining tertiary education. And that sounds like quite a bit. In low birth weight, it's 8%. And all this sounds quite a bit if we think that 40% of the cohort hadn't made tertiary education. So roughly 20% in relative effect size in relative terms. Now, how much this matters for at the population level? So that's for which we calculated these attributable fractions. And what we see that even though at the individual level, it seems that we can find that being small for gestational age and having low birth weight, that has not a non-negligible effect of attaining tertiary education. At the population level, this is very small. So the population attributable fraction is 0.5. So, but we would just say that this indicates that if we could eliminate both of these conditions, the population with tertiary degrees would be just 0.5% higher. So very little change at the population. And obviously this would be a bit higher if we use the random effects models instead, but still relatively moderate, and these would strictly be upper bound measures. So in terms of conclusions that we find that these prenatal health as an individual level effect, especially in terms of low birth weight, but otherwise the other conditions don't really matter. So that we would conclude that there's a limited effect on educational attainment, and it's even more limited at the population level. But the population relevance of prenatal health or educational outcomes is limited. And this also implies that prenatal health is probably not the major contributor to social mobility. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to hear questions when we go to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can stop sharing the slides.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. I will move on to the next slideshow, which is my own. I'll try not to abuse my position as moderator and taking more time. Yeah, Alex will be exactly. Okay, so if Juho talked about the beginning of life, I'm going to talk to you about the end of life, a little less optimistic. And as many of you know, I'm a demographer, trained as a demographer, but I'm also a sociologist here at the Department of Sociology at the University of Tel Aviv. And the types of questions that interest me are the relationship between the social and the demographic. And today I'd like to talk about mortality inequalities, but thinking about it a little more sociologically. So the title of the talk is Formalizing Shifting Mortality Inequalities, a Multivariate Approach. This is joint work with Iñaki Permanier at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona. And the motivation for this study, this is an ongoing study, it's work in progress. I really prefer presenting something I'm still working on rather than something that's already published and you can read. So there's a lot of open questions here, but I hope to engage you in the conversation. And the motivation to this study is basically, we've seen over the past 2 centuries, roughly since the Industrial Revolution, that human lifespans have, or life expectancy have increased, but throughout this process, human lifespans have become more equal. Yet at the same time, we find the social inequalities and mortality persist even in high-income countries, including some of the countries that are considered most egalitarian. And this is in some of my previous work, and as well as collaborators, we see growing inequalities and mortality in the United States for sure, but also in Sweden and Finland, which we don't immediately think about when we think about social inequalities. And then as a sociologist, I always go back to thinking about the system of social stratification, which is the basis upon valued goods are distributed in society, including health and longevity. So a fundamental question for me, and I think to the field hopefully, is how does the system of social stratification change over time, and specifically what is the role of the social determinants of health in determining life chances? If we look at the literature on mortality inequalities, which is vast, it's been a very successful research agenda over the past 5 decades, we see this tendency to treat inequalities in mortality as disparate phenomena. So we look at gender inequality, we look at racial or ethnic inequality, we look at socioeconomic inequality. And this is very valuable, but I would like to argue today that we need to look at these together, because if you think about the system of social stratification, over time, the basis upon which valued goods are distributed changes from one attribute to another. And this is a very interesting, at least I hope, a sociological question. To give you an example, we can look at smoking behavior, which is a sort of proximate cause of mortality and health outcomes. We can look at smoking behavior, and this is a very simple graph just showing us the odds ratios of ever having smoked 100 cigarettes in life. It's a very stable question that we can track in the National Health Interview Surveys in the United States for about 5 decades. The same question has been asked, one of the few questions that are consistent. And here I'm just predicting, using logistic regression, what are the odds of ever being a smoker in your life annually. And here I look at the gender and educational predictors. So education is comparing the third to the first education tertile. And this is controlling for race, Hispanic origin, and age. But what we find here, I think, is very interesting. And this is not new, we know this from many studies, but we see that gender has become less important predictor of smoking behavior, whereas education or socioeconomic status more generally has become a lot more important. So this, you need to invert these curves in your head, because it's the odds ratio, and then gender becomes less important over time, so the blue line is going up, approaching 1, a ratio of 1, whereas SES is becoming more important. So if you study these phenomena individually, you think maybe you think about gender or you think about socioeconomic status, but if you look at them together, I think to me as a sociologist, the conclusion is that smoking as a social behavior has changed from a gender-based behavior to a class-based behavior. So again, looking at the United States, in 1950, over 50% of men had smoked, compared to less than 10% of women, and now basically there's very minor differences between men and women. But if you ever spend time in an American college, you will see that nobody smokes, whereas only the less educated people in America, obviously it's a generalization, but smoking prevalence is much higher. So this is the kind of questions that are interesting to me, to think about inequalities in mortality and health behaviors over time, and how they change based on specific social attributes. If you look at, descriptively still, if you look at life expectancy, this is the female life advantage, or longevity advantage at birth. So this is the difference in life expectancy in years between women and men. In 23 high-income countries, the data are taken from the Human Mortality Database. Again, over 7 decades, we track this. So each gray line is one country, and you can see the average trend in red. So we see this peak of female longevity advantage around the 70s, early 80s, and then it goes down again. Half of this gap roughly is due to smoking, by the way, but this is a separate issue. And again, we find that inequality based on gender went up a lot. then went down. In Israel, by the way, it looks very different. It's pretty stable, this gap, but it's not shown here. If you look at the US, we also see a very significant decline in racial inequalities. We hear a lot about racial inequalities. We always think it's moving in a bad direction, but if you look at mortality or longevity, it's actually a success story. There's still a big gap, but it declined by 50% from 1989, basically, where it peaked. So looking at blacks and whites, if the gap in 1989 was 7 years of life expectancy at birth, now the gap is about 3.5 years. So good news overall. When you look at socioeconomic disparities, and here I'm measuring it for education, this is from my own research and some colleagues. You know this for many countries, but here I'm showing you for 4 very different countries: the United States, Finland, Spain, and Israel. The Israel estimates are from the Central Bureau of Statistics, so I know some participants here today. And we see overall that there's really this upward trend, growing inequalities in life expectancy. This is at age 25, 30, 35, varying by country, but overall the trend is very clear. So I'm trying to think about these different forms of inequality. Some of them are diminishing, some of them are increasing, but today we look at the literature, and a lot of it is it focuses on disparate phenomena. So only when we look at these together, we start thinking about how does stratification change in society. So the question is, how do we formalize these trends jointly? It turns out to be a pretty difficult question methodologically. This is because there's a lot of inequality indices, and there's a lot of composition methods that have been developed over the years, a lot of them from economics, and also translated and developed individually or separately in demography as well. And the question is, so how do we formalize these inequalities to be between and within group inequality? The problem is that many of these decompositions, they require the groups to be mutually exclusive. And this is a really tough methodological problem, because we know that they're not mutually exclusive when we talk about race, gender, education, and so on, because you can belong to multiple categories at once. So I'm working with the Iñaki that I mentioned at the beginning, and sort of solutions to this problem. There's no mathematical solution that's been shown, but we're trying to think of innovative ways, like counterfactual analysis and so on, to figure this out. Today I'll just show you a decomposition, a very simple one that only focuses on between group inequality. So this is the inequality in life between means, basically, in average lifespan between these 3 factors that I mentioned. And then if I have some sort of general inequality index here, today I'll show you results from the variance in life expectancy. And our goal is to decompose the inequality due to education, gender, and race to its components. So the C of education, the component of education, component by gender, and component by race. And we can calculate this, whatever inequality measure. We start with no inequality, meaning that we have no groups at all. We look at there's no between group component, and we want to reach the final, basically, the part at the bottom, this one, which is the maximal inequality wherein we include all 3 factors. So this is not a regression analysis, but you can very easily sort of make the analogy, and it's very similar to regression. It's really, the decomposition really depends on which component you add first. So if I add education first, and then I add gender, so this is the residual inequality due to gender after I've included education, and then third I add the race or ethnic component, and this is the residual from after adding the first 2 components. But I can just as well start from gender and then go add education and then race and so on. So there are 6 different pathways if we have 3 factors, and of course each one will give us different estimates for each component. So what we do here, we basically take all the pathways and we average the contribution from each component. This is very standard in the literature. This is what you get in the end. It's very similar to the Shapley decomposition if you're familiar with it, but I don't want to spend too much time on the details. There's some limitations. It captures only between group differences in means. We're working on the within group inequality. That's for future work. It's path dependent, as I said. We solve this by averaging, and it's also sensitive to the number of categories in each factor. If you add more education categories, that of course it would increase the variance and so on. But I'll leave this to the discussion. And I'll show you some results from the United States. hoping to work now with Israeli data as well, and as well as Swedish data with collaborators at Stockholm University. But I'll show you preliminary results for the United States. This is decomposing, this is the variance in between group means, or basically life expectancy across these three components. In 1990, you see that 12% of the variance of the inequality was due to education, 27% due to race, blacks and whites specifically in this case, and the remainder, over 60%, was due to gender inequality. Fast forward almost 3 decades, and you see that now education is responsible for about 2/3 of the inequality, race only for 3% of the inequality, and gender for the remaining third, basically. And we can also, and this is fixing the proportion, so basically saying the population composition is fixed in those periods. If we want to take of course, there's been expansion of education during this time, so if we want to factor that, we can sort of use this counterfactual decomposition. We say, what happens if we freeze the population proportions throughout, and what happens if we let the mortality component change, and vice versa? And then we get that a lot of it, this is mostly due to mortality, changes in mortality within each of these groups. Not so much the compositional effect, which is blue. So this is just as a side note. To summarize, the total variance in life expectancy at age 25 declined through 2010 roughly, then it started increasing again in the United States based on these three factors. And as I said, the main point from this is that education is, going back to Wolfgang's talk, education is the most important predictor of longevity that we find today consistently across societies. And this is just an example from the United States. Just a limitation that these are only due to these three factors, so of course we're limited to them in this case. So to summarize, I think that formalizing shifts in mortality inequalities can improve our understanding of long-term changes in the system of social stratification, particularly as they relate to the distribution of health resources, and not healthcare resources, health resources. This is an important distinction that I'm happy to discuss later. Although our analysis is focused in the United States, we've observed these trends in many societies, including the ones I mentioned and showed you earlier today. And I think moving forward, I think it would be very interesting to consider not just sort of this approach, which kind of factors out these components, but also think about the interaction effects between these components. For example, looking at the United States, if you look at low-educated Americans, blacks or whites, at bottom levels of education, they look very similar. They have very similar life expectancy. But at the top, there's still a racial, or blacks still have a penalty at the high end of the educational distribution. So there's some interaction effects that are going on here, and we need to think about how to do this in the analysis as well. So thank you for listening, and now I would like to open the floor to discussion, not just of the last paper, but all the papers we've been seeing today. So please, if you have any questions, you can direct them to our panelists. John.
First of all, thank you very much. Have real international conference in Israel. A couple of questions or comments. Going to Eliahu and to Isaac. I think really the projection of age composition is a very good starting point. I would like to suggest, a few things that might, in a multidimensional way, affect the outcome, given that I cannot see fertility in this country seriously going down without a cataclysmic change in the whole social demographic structure, which may be happening given good conditions of persons in the next 5 years. You don't know what will happen. But I think there are a number of things which you cannot just look at the aggregate. They're important. You mentioned some structural differences in the health of the population, the adult population, some of which becomes more important, some of which becomes, and which in many ways boiled down to educational structure. There's also questions of income inequality, which is very high in this country, in the structuring of certain populations which are doomed to low income. There's the whole issue of migrant labor, which is a growing proportion of the labor force, and under the table, a growing proportion of the population, which isn't even observed by most formal statistics. And finally, we should be talking about the interactions with the Palestinian population, the Palestinian economy, which is an open border, and again, doesn't exist in Israeli statistics. So
Just, my answer is thank you. You are right. We should extend the research. It's a lot to do. There are not too many demographers, not only in these rooms. I think most of the demographers in the country are in this room. So have a lot of work to do, and there are very important aspects that we didn't mention. For example, something that Professor Schultz referred to, the compositional effect that I mentioned, just it's a very, very important factor here, how the population is changing in at least three subgroups, like the population. Projections have been prepared that we are talking about very different demographic regimes of different groups, that they have they do not have any meeting point. They don't marry between ultra-Orthodox and non-ultra-Orthodox Jews. They don't marry with Arabs, etc. We're talking about groups that are totally independent, and they develop in a different way. Compositional effects are very, very important also to be included. But as you said, there is a lot of work to do.
Any question?
I have a question to Professor Härkönen.
Juho, there's a question for you.
Yeah, I guess that you have to go to come to the mic. You are coming?
Good morning. You talked about prenatal health mainly. I wonder whether you could get some data on prenatal education, like some bonding that happens with the mother, the number of stories told at the very early age, because I think Jim Heckman more intended to discuss these kinds of effects on future outcomes.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question.
Thanks, thank you for the talk. I'm just going to add. So looking. So I wonder if the Finnish school system, which I know is extremely good, is also picking up intervening in the interceding years between birth and when you're measuring the education outcomes, to fix some of the issues which would have emerged from.
I can just follow up on this because Finland is of course unique in having this so-called neola system. This is something in between birth and entering school, where really it's a social and psychological assistance to the parents. And actually there is the hypothesis maybe some of the good performance of Finland in the PISA studies in school, or maybe even being the happiest country in the world, has to do with this special emphasis on early childhood development. This is also just a question to you.
Okay, thanks for all the questions. On the first one, yeah, indeed, Heckman himself has more focus on these interactions in the very first years, and also after the child is born. But I think that a lot of this research on the prenatal period has been influenced by this idea that, okay, we should look at like really the first environments, the first stages of life on this. On the registers, on the data that we have, we don't have information on this. There are some other data that Heckman has used and others who have used it more focused on interventions, and of course that there are cohort studies which try to capture these. The cohort studies, of course, then have their own issues, but if you don't have siblings or other, then there's the endogenetic questions always remain. Now on the questions about that is Finland a special case? We actually have an extra slide on this where we asked ourselves the same question, and so what we did was that we kind of took some previous studies to try to estimate the population attributable fractions from previous studies, and actually finding all the numbers that are needed was not so easy, but still we made a thought experiment that if the effect size doubles of low birth weight, if the effect size is doubled, but what happens, and also that if we move the low birth weight prevalence to that of the US, and obviously the population attributable fraction increases, but it increases to 3.5%, and we're talking about percent. So it would still be relative, or it would still be a small effect that that Finland, in some respects, in this is a special case, but the big picture, the big conclusions, we argue that wouldn't really change. And as kind of a side note, that actually the PISA results in Finland have started going down, as have the educational levels. That later cohorts have less education than the cohorts in the early 70s. So.
Okay, any more questions?
Yeah. You want to?
I just have a comment I would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't need. So to Ben-Moshe, to Dr. Ben-Moshe, two quick questions. One, if I understand correctly, the effect of fertility is also going to affect the GDP per capita, not only through the age composition, but also through the effects on productivity, which you did not put in this model, but point in the same direction, right? And the second question is, do you have any model for where ultra-orthodox fertility is going to go? You know, that might be affected by some policies, by some child benefits, tax cuts, but is there any more general model about where this is going? And to Professor Sasson, Professor. So some of these, I mean, looking at the mortality gap between men and women, right? So some of the life-shortening activities that men do were at least high status, right? Eating red meat, smoking, engaging in more violent or risky behavior. These were within a classic gender structure. These were high status activities. So is there a status element? Is it that highly educated people now, their high status activities are also they're also safer, or how do you put this?
So we definitely see a masculinization of female behavior, in health behaviors. So I think in this case, it's been detrimental to women's health. And so they're kind of catching up with men in the unhealthy stuff. So this is something we've been seeing in many countries, and it has to do with the reduction in gender differentiation that we've seen in the last several decades. So there's definitely some of that. And if you think about status, I mean, I forget the name of this book, but since the 80s, basically, and you can also go to radio even before. We know that so if you think about distinction, that, like you said, high status groups, they try to distinguish themselves, and I think now it's considered moral imperative almost to live a healthy life if you belong to a certain class. So I think there's definitely some of that, and of course we don't see it in the data because we only look at mortality, but all of these things are really underlying these trends, and I think this is really worthwhile looking at.
Regarding the first question, the model is oversimplified, what I presented here, the demographic dividend. There are many exogenous and endogenous factors. That means fertility, all the variables are interconnected between them. Of course, productivity and participation rates are depending also in the proportion of working ages. Macro level, it's perfectly clear. So these are things that need to be introduced. But as in the models that Professor Schultz presented, the advantage of this macro is that it gives us a picture at the macro level, a very, very macro level that can be, of course, improved, but we have some limitations on that. Regarding what's going to happen to fertility, it's a very nice question that I will be happy to have an answer. Personally, I believe that the fertility of all the groups is going to decline because life is demanding and the crisis in the housing system, the housing market, the crisis in the roads, the crisis, wherever you look at crisis, you just see population growth. Yes, so fertility is going to decline, I guess. Like Cato said, I'm saying that for 20, 30 years. I was not right until now. I experienced also a decrease in fertility when I was saying that, but I believe that fertility will decrease in the future for all the groups. Yes, but the question is, it's going to decline fast enough for the society to get the benefits of these demographic dividends. I'm pessimistic.
We'll take one last question to Wolfgang.
Thank you. So I'll keep this brief. I wonder if the complex model, the multidimensional model, includes, let's say, the impact of migration on both on the destination countries. We're seeing some signs in terms of political conflict, social conflict, on the sending countries in terms of there's an increasing number of wealthy countries which are competing for a diminishing supply of skilled migrants, or leaving the poorer countries of the world destitute. So I know that your institute has been a key player in developing these global models, and I wonder to what extent those sorts of factors, right?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, this multidimensional demographic model is its pure form just a mathematical model. It's just adding dimensions. It doesn't go into any of these issues of integration or social consequences. But of course, the models by themselves, they do differentiate between not only the age structure of the migrant and the gender, but also the education of the migrants and labor force participation. So in this one simulation that I showed that came out last year in PNAS, there we really show that migrants, migrants who are better educated, much more quickly integrate into the labor market of the receiving countries, and therefore sort of positively contribute also to the productivity and in a way sort of the demographic bonus or the demographic dividend, however you will call it. And another issue that also, not only globally, but also within the European Union, is sort of a very difficult issue, is sort of equity concerns. Of course, Western Europe is benefiting a lot from Eastern European migrants, even within the EU, like Bulgarians, Romanians, sucking up sort of the most skilled because we pay better in the West, and also they find it more attractive, the academic or whatever environment in the West. So this raises some very serious issues, which are a consequence even of the free movement within the EU. It becomes more complex because there's no free movement on a global level. So the whole discussion in the European countries these days about migration is not so much dominated by the benefits that it brings to the labor force of your own population, or possibly the brain drain it causes to developing countries, but it's really dominated by concerns about these asylum seekers and refugees who are uncontrolled movements, and many of them tend to be very low-skilled people who come from Afghanistan or wherever. And of course, they have also the biggest cultural difference, and there are serious integration issues. So it's a truly multidimensional thing. But since you're right, in these global models, we do both take the perspective from the sending countries and from the receiving countries. We intimately deal with this. I mean, the one positive model that is on the table and that the UN has also advertised is what we call circular migration. That people not as traditionally move once in a lifetime to a different country, but they come for some time, contribute to the labor force in that country, learn some additional skills, send money back home to their relatives, and then at some point bring their skills back home and go back home, and then others come. So this is really sort of a win-win-win strategy. It's good for both the sending and the receiving country, and it's good for the migrants and their families. But we are still rather far away from the legal framework conditions that allow this.
Okay, thank you very much. We will take a 10-minute coffee break and resume to the next session. So please be on time because we started a little late. Okay, our second session is a little closer to home, and we'll hear 3 speakers this time about opportunities and challenges in demographic research in Israel specifically. We'll start with Analia Schlosser from the Department of Economics, who will tell us about a very exciting project that is now taking place here at the university.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me. And this is a bit different. This talk will be very different than the talks heard before. It's more like a promo talk. I'm going to promote a few projects we're trying to advance here at the Tel Aviv University. So also the place to say thanks to all the people who are helping this to happen, from the funding side and also the logistical side, also from the Center for Statistics, who is also with us in this vision. The idea, I stole your logo here from the Center for Statistics, but I think it's a joint collaboration, and I'm very happy to tell about this. The idea is to establish here at the university, at the Tel Aviv University, a data center to work with the microdata from the Central Bureau of Statistics. And I think that first of all, I will talk about why working with Israeli data is an interesting, it's interesting not only for Israelis, but also for researchers around the world, and also in terms of policy. As we heard before in the previous session, actually, it gave us a good motivation. We have a very heterogeneous population with a large share of immigrants, which is interestingly were coming from different countries, some developed countries, some developing countries, so it's an interesting mixture of countries, different ethnicities and religious affiliations, large variation in family size across demographic groups, so it also allows to study very interesting dynamics in terms of fertility, this huge heterogeneity that we have in dynamics. We have also, together with that, we have households with traditional values and households with much modern values, and different levels and trends in educational attainment, employment, fertility rates, and additional key socioeconomic variables. And all these melting pot of individuals, so they are all under the same institutions and policies. So it's interesting to see sometimes to study the effect of the same policy, how it varies across different groups. There are also variation across policies as well, but many of these institutions are the same, and it's interesting to study this. Together with this very interesting population that we have here in Israel, we have very good data, which I think is it's undersold. I think that the Israeli data has some key features that make it unique and important for research in a general level. First of all, we have a population registry where we have a unique ID for each individual. So some of the things I'm saying here are trivial for Israelis, but I think it's not trivial for people who do research and try to study the same questions with US data or data from other countries or from developing countries as well. So we have a unique ID which is given at birth for polygeniation to Israel. And in our population registry, you have also the ID of your parents, if they were born in Israel. So, if you were born in Israel, you have to register the ID of your parents. So this allows to really build dynasties over time. And the population registry also records country of birth, year of immigration, religion, marital history, and residential history. So it's possible to follow these dynamics over time. Together with that, and everything is here stored at the premises of the Center Bureau of Statistics. there are administrative data from many different dimensions of the life course of an individual, which is transferred from different public offices to the Central Bureau of Statistics. So there are a lot of data on education, school enrollment, test scores, matriculation exams, educational attainment, crime data, data about the recipients of welfare benefits, tax records, which allow us to examine income, employment, and the causes of death, and we also have firm data. Everything is stored at the premises of the Central Bureau of Statistics. Of course, in order to analyze the data, you need to go there to the secure room, and the idea here is to establish a secure room similar to what we are doing, the same research that we are doing there at the Central Bureau of Statistics. The secure room at the Central Bureau of Statistics works under the big 5 safes, which is, first of all, safe people only can get access to this data. Only researchers from Israeli institutions or from research institutes who are approved by the Central Bureau of Statistics. Safe project, which means that the project is of interest of the Central Bureau of Statistics or provides a significant contribution either to the scientific literature or policy. Safe setting, which is also an important issue to highlight, which is this research is only conducted at the research room that provides secure and protective environment to the data analysis. And the safe data, as I said, I told you about all these rich data sets, that everything is de-identified and anonymized to make sure that there is no possibility to identify any individual person, firm, school, etc. And safe output, which is also another important link in this chain, which means that the Central Bureau of Statistics goes to every single output we produce there to make sure that there is no violation of the privacy requirements of the Central Bureau of Statistics. At this time, this was an opportunity to mention another collaboration and trying and promoting, which is together with the Data Science Center at Tel Aviv University and the Central Bureau of Statistics. Researchers from the computer science and engineering here are collaborating in a joint collaboration with the Central Bureau of Statistics, trying to see what are their challenges in this big safe and trying to think of practical solutions for these big safe challenges. So I want us to finish talking about the potential this CBS data center at Tel Aviv University, that hopefully we will see it the next time we meet. Hopefully we will see it running already. We are now in the final stages of finalizing the contract and all the logistics. I think it will increase research productivity, which it will expand the pool of researchers who do empirical work based on data from Israel. I think it will also attract researchers and students from the international community. This to collaborate with researchers in Israel. I think that this uniqueness and richness of the data, together with the population that I described before, really brings very interesting questions that could be answered using Israeli data. I think it will also promote synergies between researchers from different disciplines that will come to the data center to work together, and new links, as I mentioned before, between data scientists from the data science center that are working on methodological issues and researchers that do empirical work in social sciences to look for that bring interesting methodological questions. I think that all of this together will have to shed light on important scientific questions and provide relevant evidence for policymakers, not only in Israel, but also other countries that face similar questions in terms of. And just to raise your curiosity of some, I will give you some examples of recent research that has been carried out at the Central Bureau of Statistics, at the research room of of the Central Bureau of Statistics. This is not a representative sample of research. I'm just mentioning here research that has been conducted mainly from colleagues of mine, or the economics department, or my students, or me myself. So it's not a representative. I'm sure there are also very interesting research that has been done. I'm not citing here, but just to give you a bit of a flavor. Questions also here, only citing papers that are related to the topic of today, which is demography. So one of the first papers was this paper of Alma Cohen, who is faculty member at the economics department, and Rajiv Deja and Dimitri Romanov, that they looked using administrative records from 300,000 families. They looked at the impacts of child allowances on fertility patterns in Israel, exploiting exogenous variation in the amount of child allowances provided to families due to policy changes. So this is a nice paper to look at. I'm not going to tell you all the story about each of the papers, just give you a kind of a taste of what can be done there. This is a paper of mine with Josh Angrist and Victor Aviv. We also look at administrative records at the Central Bureau of Statistics to look at one of the most studied questions in social sciences, which is the trade-off, or the potential trade-off between family size and children outcomes. Again, the uniqueness of this data is that we can link individuals as adults with their families of origin using a very large data set, because we have access to all the administrative data. So we can look at their outcomes as adults, but really look at their original families. This is another project of mine with a student of mine, Ladem Alaf, who's doing a PhD at Tel Aviv, and Tatiana Barion, who was a PhD student at Tel Aviv and now is a faculty member at Ben-Gurion. We are looking at the short and long-term effects of universal preschool among the Arab population in Israel. Again, we are now exploiting some exogenous variation in access to preschool that was derived by the gradual implementation of the compulsory preschool law for ages 3 and 4 over the years. And we can match these kids who were, for the first time, exposed or enjoyed from preschool education with their long-term outcomes. We have test scores, we look at the matriculation exams, we have their crime records, educational attainment at university, and we have data on their parents, their labor force participation, etc., etc. So it's a very big project we will carry out at the Central Bureau of Statistics. Another project related to demographic question of a student of mine, Nomi Gershoni. I was mentioning before some potential for international collaboration. This is a project of Nomi Gershoni with Corinne Lowe. Nomi was my PhD student. Corinne was a PhD student at Columbia. She was very interested in this question: what happened to when IVF technologies appeared, and how this changes marital decisions of women and decisions of investment in education and attainment. I linked between these two highly motivated students, and it turned out to be a very nice paper that they look at the impact of IVF technologies on marriage patterns in Israel. Another nice paper of two former students of mine who were my master's students, and they're now both of them doing a PhD in the US. They look at the impact of place of residence, a very long-studied questions in different contexts, the impact of place of residence in childhood, in long-term outcomes. The interesting part of this project is that they're comparing the differential impact for immigrants and for natives. So how initial place of residence differentially impacts your long-term outcomes depending on where you are an immigrant or you're native born. Another project of a master's student of ours who is now doing a PhD. He's looking at intergenerational mobility in Israel, but looking not only in general, but within different groups, trying to study or to understand what are the different channels that can explain this intergenerational mobility across groups. And just to finalize on the last project, Israel, as you all know, startup nation, and this is also another project that I'm involved on together with IIASA Porta, and Yona Hackett was a student of mine who wrote his PhD thesis under my supervision. And again, it's less of a demographic question, but just to finish with something that relates very much to the Israeli economy. And what Yona looked at, and we are now working also as a follow-up project, is trying to understand what are the drivers or what are the characteristics of these individuals who become startup innovators, and trying to see what are the underrepresented populations in these startup innovations. So just to give you a flavor of what could be done there, and that's it. Question?
Hey, thank you very much. I am personally very excited about this initiative because I already have 2 projects with the Research Data Center at the CBS. So it'll be really great to have it here. So I think there's a lot to discuss between us. And
good question. We don't know. We are still in the legal issues or logistical issues. It will happen. We have the money, which is not wrong.
But we hope in 2023 to move to other modes, working with the criminal service.
Yeah, we know.
I hope it's later 2023 to criminal access. It's more easier for researchers.
I think there's a lot of potential because if you look at Sweden, which is about roughly the same size population as Israel,
this year,
20 times the size.
Not next year.
Exactly. But the same size population, and it's one of the most studied societies on the planet. Partly because they're kind of weird, but also because my wife is Swedish, I'm allowed to say this. But also because they have great data and they give access to the data. So I think this could really boost research in Israel, which, like we said, is a very interesting society in its own right. And more about that, I'll turn it over to Alex Weinreb.
All right, so I'm going to talk about something completely different already. Well, a little different. So I'm somebody who did benefit from a capacity building and from circular, and I was a circular migrant. And now it's time to come home and to try to build a nest here, and then have my little birds and send them off to fly freely. So I'm going to talk about the state of demographic science in Israel. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go over some of the things which we've already been because this is about the message of sending a message, as every politician knows, supposedly, I've never been one, is you repeat it. Here is the Israeli age structure. We haven't seen it by single year yet, and there's an advantage to seeing it by single year because because you don't smooth out any of the functions. And on the left side we have the Jewish population. On the right side we have the Arab population. This is the population as of the middle of 2021. But not surprisingly, it looks pretty similar to the population of 2020 or the population of 2000 even, and you have these distinct echo effects. We've already seen a really, really nice version of this where it's broken down by education, but like Professor Lutz said, Israel's age structure is really, or Israel's population is really unusual because it combines the sort of age structure which we find in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the area I spent the first 20 years of my life researching, with the educational profile of Western Europe, and it's extremely unusual. All right. Of course, as our ex-president said, we are a country of tribes. Each tribe has its own demographic regime. And this is reflected in the distinct age profiles of each population. On the top left, I can see it here. On the top left are non-Haredi Jews. To the right, in the orange, is the Haredi Jews. In gray is the non-Bedouin Muslims. The yellow is the Bedouin, where that's typically southern district. Christians and Druze who are small populations, and then the other, which is the fastest growing population in Israel, and this was mentioned earlier. The fastest growing population of Israel is this category of other, now past 500,000 mark this year, growing at about 4% per year. So basically, so Israel's population is unusual. What's driving it, as we've heard, is the fertility rate. Here's a TFR in OECD countries from 1970 until now. Israel just looks completely different. It did come down in parallel to them in the 1970s, but then it froze, and it's been frozen there basically ever since, rising from the mid-1990s until about 2012. Recently, in the last few years, and the Taub Center will be putting out a paper on this later this year. Just the first thing we are seeing the signs of a reduction, and it's a shame that Eliahu is not here, so because we could confirm some of his stuff. But we remain very high. We also have increasing net immigration into Israel. For all the Israeli discourse about Israelis leaving, we have more people coming in, and with time we have more and more people coming in. The net effect. So the total effect of high fertility and increasing in-migration means the population is growing at 1.9% per year or so on average over the last 20 years. So the population doubles, as we all learn in the introduction to demography. 1.9% growth rate is a doubling time of about 36 years. And that's we add about 200,000 people to our population every year. I mean, it's quite astounding. Alongside that, there are social markers where we're also unique. And again, I'm pushing the thing. Israel has a unique population sort of has unique combination of population parameters with other social measures. Labor force participation in Israel is really high. We're especially for women. For women, we are at least non-Haredi, non-Arab women, the second highest in the OECD. So alongside the TFR, which blows everybody out of the water, women are also working. It's a very unusual combination. All right. The Taub Center is we had the Israel team, we are the Israel team on the National Transfer Accounts Project, which is a project which combines age structure with other basically with national account systems. Israel also has a very special sort of age pattern of income and transfers, and what that basically means is here we've compared ourselves to we enter the labor force later, but we also exit later. The effective age at retirement in Israel is not the legal age at 67, which is already high by international standards. It's 71, and it's climbing, and it's higher for people who are more educated. So as Israel becomes more educated, more and more people stay in the labor market for longer. So part of when we by default use these measures of labor force participation ending at 64, for Israel it increasingly doesn't matter, especially when you consider this big bump here, this big bump which is about to enter sort of the 70, 75 plus. An increasing share of these guys are working. So anyway, all of this means that there are lots and lots of questions. So, if I had to pick the top 10, what makes Israel unique, why we should study it, why there should be demographers beating down the doors to get in and use our data and study it, I would say that this is it. So unusually young age structure with notable cohort fluctuations. Those are always interesting because you can always leverage them to all sorts of fun stuff. Extremely heterogeneous population. We have multiple groups, tribes, whatever you want to call them, but the core point is that they each have distinct demographic features and different sorts of participation in education and the labor market. We have top 10 life expectancy, top 5 for men, top 10 for women, long-standing high fertility, annual growth rate 1.9%, rising rates of in-migration. I'm not even considering the rising numbers of labor migrants who are coming in, usually under bilateral labor agreements, but some of those people stay. high rates of college educated, etc., etc. But, so that's on the ground, and the challenges, this is what I want to focus on. There is no longer, and I have to emphasize, no longer a comprehensive training program in demography in Israel. There was. In the early 1940s, there was one established at Hebrew University, and it lasted until about 2002. And then it was folded into the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I was the first hire into that department after it had been folded. And the number of graduate students that I got when I was a faculty member from 2004 to 2009 was precisely 0. And the reason it was 0 is because basically because when you fold the Department of Demography into the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in the Israeli system, they have to do what are called makeup courses. They have to ashlamot, right, in sociology. Most demographers do not come up through sociology. They come through statistics and geography and maybe maths and a bunch of other things. Forcing them to come through sociology is going to turn them off, and it did. So all right. So anyway, so this has had two sets of results. It has eliminated most potential graduate candidates. I'm talking in general. Obviously, there are exceptions, right? It's largely eliminated demographers under age 45. If you want to do demography, you do what IIASA does, which is go to the States or go somewhere else. You cannot do it here. But that's also a problem. It's because we also have our own domestic patterns, and we need to. People outside aren't aware of them. So we need to be training some of them. Because we restricted people to coming up through sociology and anthropology, so the parts of demography which have been focused on much more are related to fertility and nuptiality, which are fine, but it's not all of demography, because demography, as anybody knows who's been in a general demographic training program, as I was, and you study mortality and morbidity, population environment, small area studies, formal mathematical demography, biodemography. They're just these areas which in a Department of Sociology and Anthropology are simply, it's not reflected in any course which you take. So what we've ended up with in Israel is something quite limited. Right, the challenge number 2. Europe has, by my count, 51 demographic research centers, not including national bureaus of statistics. The only European countries which do not have one, and this is the club which Israel belongs to, are Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Cyprus, Iceland, Albania, and Kosovo. Right? You're not supposed to be able to read this little printout from the Excel here, right? But obviously, I can send it to anybody who's interested. But Israel doesn't have the same demographic patterns as those countries. Those countries are fine. They can simply look at what their neighbors are like because they have the same age structure and labor market profile and everything else. So we're not like that. So and we're also not small, and we're also not poor any longer. If we have a different age structure and everything else, then arguably we need our own population center as well. What are the consequences of this here? As I've discovered, as I first saw when I was on the faculty, and I've discovered since coming back or seen over the years and watched some of my able colleagues leave Israel to go elsewhere because there is no institutional support here. Okay, talk about demographic issues is dominated by non-demographers. There's a lot of talk of demography in Israel, as anybody here knows. It's on the airwaves. Politicians talk about it. Policymakers who are not politicians, everybody's talking about it, but they make a lot of mistakes. Demographers are rarely appointed to government committees, and of course they can't be because there are only 4 of us in the country. I'm exaggerating, but if you have 120 committees, and how many are we? 10. But beyond that, they don't ask us to be on committees because we are invisible. We don't have a home department. There's no center. There's nothing. We are the Jews of the Israeli social science world. We have no homeland. So Judenstaat, here we come, or whatever. Okay, so all right. So what that means in consequence is that policy debates and decisions are demographically illiterate. And now that I'm at a policy research bureau, I was a member I was doing academic demography for a long time. I'm now doing policy, And I just, the things which I hear, the things which I see, is people don't know. So anything, things which you learn your first 2 years of formal demographic study, right? Relative size of cohorts. People just don't know. Rates versus numbers. People are constantly using the numeric register of one when they should be using the other. They don't convert. Problems of aggregation. I mean, Norm Ryder's one of his other things. I mean, tempo versus quantum. It's really important to distinguish these sorts of things, and I just don't see it happening because there are too many elementary errors which are made. People don't have the training. So, all right. So what we're doing at the Taub Center is we're aside from putting together a growing number of studies and now hosting national transfers accounts. We just finished the first estimates, and we're putting them out. We are in early 2023. We're starting a formal collective where we're going to have bi-monthly brown bags, like research. We're going to ask everybody here. I had no idea about your research. That's terrible. Good. I mean, so we're going to be collecting. Anybody who's working on these issues is going to send stuff to us, and we're going to put it out to a community, which is going to looking for potential collaborations with foreign partners. Medium term, establish a professional association. That's how you plant a flag somewhere, and you're like, okay, who wants to know about demographic issues? There they are, the association, right? And then the final thing, of course, because this is what I really want. Get enough support to establish a standalone graduate program, or if not standalone, at least it's in collaboration with the program somewhere else. Like that's the thing. We don't have to rely on the solution to send a single able student who has somehow made it through all the filters into being interested in this stuff. Say, okay, go to America, or not for 5-6 years. Send them to a special training program for 3 months. Then if they're interested for a year, that you need to establish something on the ground. And that's pretty much where I am. So anyway, thank you. I'm sorry this is not academic at all, but I was asked to talk about the opportunities and challenges. We're all talking about, we know that we have such rich data, and we have so many really skilled social scientists here. So now we just need to create the structure which enables the joining of those two things. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alex. If Analia talked about the opportunities, Alex was there to counter with the challenges. Always fascinating to hear. I'm a little biased because Alex was my doctoral supervisor. And as some of you are learning now, this is a lifelong relationship. Even though I graduated almost 10 years ago, it's like parents. There's always this relationship that carries on.
I'm a very proud parent. If only my other children were successful.
Wait till I get to my teenage years. Rebel a bit. For our final speaker, Daniel Gotlieb.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar, this workshop. I would like to talk about the difference between completed fertility and total fertility. What we've seen today, I think, was all total fertility from beginning to now. And I think it's very important to look at completed fertility if we want to understand changes in fertility. So how do I go along? Okay. Completed fertility looks at the mother and counts all the children born during the period of fertility of the mother. Total fertility is an average of the various years. The data of this study are basically the administrative data of the National Insurance Institute. Before I left them, I did this work together with Ophir Pinto and David Piton. And for some aspects, we also needed to use the social survey of the Central Bureau of Statistics. It's we assume that women's fertility is between age 15 and 44. We also made further extensions, looking at age 10 till 49. These things are changing over time. Okay, and the work stopped by 2016, although if we were to do it today, we would probably go to 2020. So you have to go back 44 years from 2020 in order to get the last cohort that you can study, and so this is what we did. This is the same picture that we saw before, and it's quite amazing to see how Israel is really different from the rest. And as you said, the few years in the end, or a short period in the end, where we see a change. This is still total fertility for the different groups of population in Israel: the Haredi, the Muslim, non-Haredi, Druze, Christian Arabs. We could distinguish further. That's the advantage of having administrative data, where you really have relatively small groups which still provide you enough data. What really made me curious about the completed fertility was, and first I have to say that the Central Bureau of Statistics is unique and is wonderful and is doing absolutely great work. But concerning the Arab women's fertility, there was a strong mistake. The forecasts were higher than expected, and we did a lot of work with the forecasts. We needed them for our social insurance sustainability studies, and then we saw that the decrease in fertility in the Arab women's fertility dropped much faster than was expected by demographers, including Eliahu, Ben-Moshe, who helped us in this matter. And there was this research by Dimitri and his colleagues, where they mentioned that the effect, one important effect on the fertility was the payments of benefits, child benefits, and of course the other one would be the education. What I think is that the education is a much more fundamental effect, and this is what happened to the Muslim and Arab women overall. They have made a tremendous change. They have been getting into education, higher education, and this has affected also the years of marriage, the age of marriage, etc. has had a strong effect, and this was understated. Here you can see total fertility TF of the Haredi and the completed fertility CF of the Haredi. They look different. The non-Haredi is smoother because it's more together because there's less change there. Okay, wherever there is change. Now I have to say that non-Haredi is a very big group, which is very heterogeneous in itself. So I hope I'll have the time to show you the differences. So what did we do basically? We took completed fertility and took it for various age groups, and there you can see already that it makes quite a difference if the oldest group, 40 to 44 years, over time, okay, that's what we're looking at, is relatively flat after the decline, it's very different for the 20 to 24 age. So here you can really see changes happening from over time for the cohorts. And that is actually what I'm trying to say. So this is the non-Haredi population. Here's the Haredi population. We see less of it, but we see some decline that starts already somewhere in 2014 or 15. It's a slow decline, but it is also increasing. Or here we have the percentage changes of the various age groups, and you see there are minus 17, minus 10, minus 15, 25, 32, minus 50% for the very young. So it's not that interesting yet, but somewhere in between these figures are really relevant. This is the Bedouin society. So we have to know that we should not be stereotypical about what happens to the Bedouin society, but we should really look at the details of the completed fertilities. I think that gives you a lot. Here's the Ethiopian community, the community of immigrants from Ethiopia. Again, you see very big changes. I do not understand the 30 to 34 years. We will have to check this, but this is what came out from the calculations. From former Soviet Union, this is quite a dramatic picture. I go on. Here we did further detail. We took every year of these groups, like 50 in age of 15, 16, 17, 18, 19.
Very sorry, I have to leave the airport. Sorry, it was top interesting, and all good luck with these efforts to establish a demographic community and society.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we see here the big changes in the Haredi women of 25 to 29, age 25 to 29. Each line is of a different age. So we see that 29 is clearly upward sloping. 25 is already quite different, very different. If we go to the older age, 35 to 39, we see they are all going up. 20 to 24, already all going down. So this is a very different picture that we get from the completed fertility than that which we get from the total fertility. In the end, we did some exercises which are problematic. First of all, we had to find out whether our completed fertility calculations give the right total fertility. So we did this calculation, and we, of course, saw that it's exactly the same number. It's not a surprise, but still it's a control to see that we did the right thing. Then, what you have to do in completed fertility, because it stops much earlier, you have to forecast. But here the forecast is not that problematic, because you're talking about a very clear group that if it changes, then it's a big mistake, but the chance that this will change is much smaller, because you have a very, you have a group that you can look at for quite some years, and if you see the downward sloping, so you can continue. Of course, it's not good enough. We would need an economic model to understand what drives fertility, and that would be even more interesting, of course, to do that in this detailed analysis. One thing that I want to mention is that, as I said, the non-Haredi society is made up of religious Haredi, mainly religious non-Haredi who live, a lot of them live in the territories. Religious, traditional, less religious, and not religious. This we took from the Central Bureau's social survey, and we see here also that in this non-Haredi group, we have the religious who are at a very high fertility rate. And then we went back to the national insurance data, looking at the people from the territories by age group. And we could see, that we have, or even in this group, we have a certain slowdown at 20 to 24, which means that things are not steady there either. And maybe one more thing about the relationship between education and fertility is that, as we saw in the Arab population, the Arab women have made a tremendous leap in education, and I think that it has to be studied, but I think this has been much less the case for men, for Arab men. And this is a type of thing that can increase tensions between the sexes, and we see a lot of tension in the criminal data, and so I think that no doubt that the educational element is extremely important for policy. We should push it forward, and we should not forget to try to do it for both sexes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left for discussion, to open up the floor for questions to any of the speakers. Yes, John.
Thank you for the presentation. First of all, if we can get the demography forward set up in this country, fantastic. As a retiree, I'll be happy to do whatever I can to push it forward. In terms of fertility, one of the interesting things, if you look at age-specific fertility, is that there has been a shift to the right of Jewish fertility. It shows up very clearly in the data. The fertility has gone down at 15, 25 age group, and has shifted so that the mode is now around age 30 or even above. Which means, on the one hand, it seems very unstable because there's very little room for maneuver. One slight change at older ages and it comes crashing down, but on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be any serious change. And I'm wondering how much of the apparent reduction in fertility in the last 2 or 3 years is really a reduction, or is just more of a shift coming up against the biological balance, What I didn't see in the data which I looked at was that this shift has not occurred in the Arab population, and I'm wondering if this is the next phase which we're going to see, which is the shift in Palestinian Arab fertility in Israel, also moving to the right as education pushes down fertility as young age.
I mean, I think what you're raising is another research question, and a hugely important one. And what I think is that the education has is very effective. It's not just shifting the fertility between ages. It's a permanent thing, but it has to be researched. I think that in the Haredi women, we also know that they are the main income earner of the family, because the men go to study, and I think this implies, it brings about a strengthening of the woman in many decisions, including, of course, in the decision of how many children to have. And when we see this change, I think it's also a permanent change, because it's very hard.
The shift, the data shows the shift.
Yes, but yes, definitely. I think it's permanent. It's something that it's not just a shifting that you'll do the same number of children later on.
No, I agree. There's a shift, not necessarily, but children will be
So
hard.
you will not see the population side, because at the same time the Haredi are their share is increasing, so that affects also the total number, but that's a matter of time. It's slow, but I think it's happening. So I think that the population perspective is less severe than.
Alex, you want to? I mean, I'll say briefly that when you look at age-specific patterns of fertility, there has been over the last 20 years an increase of about 3 years, I think, in the age of first birth in the non-Arab population. There's an increase in the Arab population too, but smaller. What's happened in the Jewish population is a shifting to all the ages. The question of the biological clock is a tricky one because it's not fixed, right? It's also shifting right to the right as well. But the decrease in fertility in Arab population is across all groups.
First of all, thank you for the warm words about Central Bureau of Statistics, all of you. Second refers to the real work. I refer you to my paper is published in Arab Economic Forum, I show in this paper that the main reduction in fertility in the last 20 years, it was in non-educated women and non-employment women. The most reduction of the total fertility rate in the Arab population, the women, was in the non-educated women and non-employment women.
That can very, very well be, depending on what period you have analyzed, because we have the changes in the benefits, in the child benefits, which affect especially for women.
No, but it's not, because it's happening. It's happening in every neighboring country as well. It's a broader change in Arab populations in the Middle East, right? Yeah.
Happening in all the Arab world, Muslim world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? I think there's a lesson to be learned from, especially from the last talk, but we've seen it throughout, is that talking about systems analysis, Wolfgang has left in such a fight, but looking at systems analysis or forecasting fertility, I think it's much more natural to work with cohort fertility or general cohort trends. And we often work with period data because it's available and it's convenient, but we all understand that the underlying social mechanisms operate at a cohort level. So it's always better to work with cohort data than kind of aggregate and move back to the period data or trends that we're trying to forecast. But in the end, these are people that operate from their own life course perspective. So I think the message is very clear, and hopefully we can move in those directions. I know the Central Bureau of Statistics is working on a new revision of forecasts. Yeah. Exactly. I know everyone on this side is aware.
We are as well.
Exactly. So just to sort of say this to the broader audience in the room, that these are the kind of ways we want to think about these trends or mechanisms.
Very sorry, there are now closing remarks.
It's 1:45. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, 12:30.
No, it was pushed to 1:45. But okay, we were told. But anyway, I think we can wrap up the discussion. So thanks everyone, the panelists and the audience. We'll continue for the concluding remarks in at least according to my schedule, 1 at room 201, and it will be followed by lunch, so please stay and continue these conversations. Thank you.